The metal drawer slammed half open with a screech that cut through the fluorescent hum like a blade through silk. Receipt paper fluttered in chaotic spirals, white fragments dancing in the harsh artificial light as the thief's weathered hand clamped down on the cash compartment with desperate force. The doorbell was still vibrating from his violent entry, a metallic shiver that seemed to hang suspended in the stale convenience store air, mixing with the scent of instant noodles and cigarette residue that clung to everything in this cramped corner of Hong Kong's endless urban maze. Subscribe to Jackie Chan, the Untold Legacy, for the real stories behind the legend. The moments when wisdom triumphed over violence. From behind the scratched laminate counter, the cashier's fingers froze over a handful of coins that had been destined for the night deposit. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in their familiar rhythm, casting everything in that peculiar greenish glow that made healthy skin look sickly and tired eyes look haunted. But something fundamental had shifted in the store's atmosphere. A customer near the refrigerated drinks section stood motionless, a plastic bottle of jasmine tea suspended halfway to his red shopping basket, droplets of condensation falling like tiny tears onto the scuffed linoleum floor. The small radio tucked behind the lottery ticket display continued its quiet murmur of late-night canapop. But underneath that ordinary soundtrack of urban life, the room had developed a different quality entirely. The air felt charged with potential energy, thick with unspoken tension. It was the feeling you get in the seconds before lightning strikes, when the hair on your arms stands up and your nervous system sends out warning signals that your conscious mind hasn't yet processed. Every person in that narrow space could sense it, though none of them could have articulated exactly what had changed. The thief was young, maybe 22, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. His faded denim jacket bore the stains of countless desperate nights, and the frayed cuffs spoke of hands that shook too much. Beneath the surface bravado, fear leaked through every pore. His movements carried that jittery energy of someone running on adrenaline, desperation, and whatever substances had convinced him this was a good idea when the night was younger and his judgment was cloudier. He had expected the familiar script that had worked before in other districts. Burst through the door with enough aggression to freeze everyone, grab the cash, let fear do the heavy lifting while he escaped into Hong Kong's alley system. Fear would be his accomplice, panic his getaway driver. Every robbery manual written in the School of Desperation taught the same lesson. Speed plus intimidation equals success. But as his fingers tightened around the drawer's metal rails, feeling the cold aluminum against his sweating palms, something unexpected began to happen. The room, which should have erupted into chaos, instead seemed to be drawing inward, becoming something else entirely. The room refused to give him what he needed. Near the end of aisle 3, positioned with casual precision, a man stood holding a small carton of milk and a package of crackers. Jackie Chan looked unremarkable. Just another customer in worn jeans and a simple shirt. Someone who might have wandered in to escape the Hong Kong humidity. His hair was slightly messed from the wind, his clothes rumpled from hours of walking the streets. But despite his relaxed posture, Jackie's eyes were already engaged in a different kind of reading. Those dark eyes, trained by decades of choreographing fights, were processing the narrow space between shelves, calculating reflections in the front window, measuring distances to the exit. His mind was mapping the room like a chess master studying a board, seeing not just where the pieces were, but where they could go and how their movements could be influenced by subtle environmental changes. The thief yanked harder at the drawer, his desperation increasing as the mechanism resisted. Metal scraped against metal with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, and loose change rattled like dice in a nervous hand. $20 notes stuck to the metal dividers, reluctant to be stolen. Coins rolled across the counter, some falling to the floor with individual pings that seemed impossibly loud. He expected shouting by now, maybe screaming, certainly some kind of alarm. Instead, he encountered something far more unsettling: complete, focused attention. Every person in the store was looking at him, but not with terror. They watched with concentrated stillness, like people witnessing something they couldn't quite categorize yet. The woman near the magazine rack had stopped reading headlines. The elderly man by the instant noodles had frozen while comparing prices. A teenager near the ice cream freezer held a melting popsicle, drops falling steadily to the floor. None of them looked away, but none looked afraid either. They seemed to be waiting for something. Jackie took one step to his left. Not toward the thief, not away from him. Just a subtle shift that appeared natural, as if he had decided to examine a different product. The movement was so small that most people missed it entirely, but it altered the room's fundamental geometry in ways that would become clear in the next 4 seconds. That single step changed sight lines, modified flow patterns, and created what architects call a pinch point, a place where available space narrows just enough to influence behavior without seeming deliberate. Jackie had become the center around which the room's energy would now organize itself. The cashier's hand moved slowly toward the stamp pad, seeking something solid and familiar. Not reaching for an alarm or weapon, but simply touching something that represented order and routine. The receipt roll spun slightly as the drawer continued resisting. These objects, stamps, receipts, metal drawers, suddenly felt like anchors in a moment sliding away from normal. How does silence become a weapon? How do 5 seconds stretch into something that feels like minutes, each heartbeat echoing with the weight of potential consequences? The answer lay not in what Jackie Chan was about to do, but in what he deliberately chose not to do. In a world where most people's first instinct is to either flee or fight, where adrenaline usually drives people toward action, regardless of whether that action is wise, Jackie had learned the infinitely more difficult art of strategic inaction. He understood something that most martial artists never grasp: that the greatest victories often come not from what you add to a situation, but from what you refuse to contribute to the chaos. The thief finally yanked the drawer free, the metal compartment coming loose with a sharp crack that echoed off the store's low ceiling. But the victory he had imagined, the moment of triumph that was supposed to energize him for the sprint to freedom, felt hollow and wrong. The metal compartment was heavier than he had expected, awkward to carry in the tight space between the counter and the magazine rack, unwieldy in a way that made rapid movement nearly impossible. The ergonomics of theft, it turned out, had not been considered when the drawer was designed. Coins spilled from the partially opened compartments, each one hitting the linoleum floor with its own distinct ping, creating a chaotic percussion section that seemed to announce his crime to the entire neighborhood. $20 notes fluttered loose from his sweating grip, drifting toward the floor like autumn leaves in slow motion. He found himself instinctively trying to catch them with his free hand, a gesture that looked increasingly ridiculous as the seconds stretched on. A would-be criminal juggling his own loot while trying to maintain an air of menace was not the image he had cultivated in his mind when planning this desperate venture. He looked up from his fumbling efforts, expecting to see the fear in people's faces that would validate his choice to intimidate rather than ask for help, that would confirm his power in this situation and energize him for whatever came next. Instead, he found something else entirely, something that his experience with previous robberies had not prepared him for. Jackie had positioned himself near the corner where aisle 3 met the store's main walkway, a location that seemed random but was actually the result of precise calculation. He wasn't blocking the exit. That would have been confrontational, would have escalated the situation in exactly the wrong direction. He wasn't threatening anyone, wasn't even looking directly at the thief in a way that might be interpreted as a challenge. Instead, he seemed to be studying the way the fluorescent light reflected off the drink cooler's glass door, as if he had become fascinated by some aspect of the store's lighting design that had never occurred to him before. But his placement had created something subtle and powerful, a psychological funnel. The thief could still leave, could still choose the path that led to the door and the street, and whatever consequences awaited him out there. But that path had narrowed without him realizing it, had become more constrained not by physical barriers, but by the way human beings naturally navigate social space. Jackie had become a fixed point around which foot traffic would naturally organize itself, and in doing so, he had begun to control the flow of the entire situations without appearing to exert any control at all. The woman by the snack display slowly set down a bag of dried seaweed snacks, her movements deliberate and careful, as if sudden gestures might shatter whatever delicate balance was forming in the air around them. An elderly man near the newspapers carefully folded the racing form he had been studying, his arthritic fingers taking their time with each crease, transforming what should have been a quick, nervous gesture into something ritualistic and calming. No one moved quickly. No one made sudden gestures that might be interpreted as aggressive or threatening. But the collective attention in the room had shifted from fear to something more complex and harder to define: curiosity mixed with calm expectation. As if they were all witnessing the opening moments of a performance whose rules they didn't understand, but whose outcome they were beginning to trust would be worth watching. What happens when a room full of strangers stops feeding a criminal the fear he needs to function? What occurs when the basic psychology of intimidation encounters a group of people who have somehow, without planning or discussion, agreed not to be intimidated? The thief's confidence began to leak away like air from a punctured tire, a slow but steady deflation that left him feeling increasingly exposed and unsure. He clutched the drawer closer to his chest, but the metal edges dug into his arms, and the weight was making his shoulders ache. Change continued to spill from the partially open compartments, creating a trail of small defeats that marked his path across the store floor like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale gone wrong. He took a step toward the door, then another, but each movement felt increasingly clumsy, as if he were learning to walk for the first time. The space around him seemed to have developed a different quality, a thickness that made every gesture require more effort than it should have. He felt like he was moving through honey, or trying to run in a dream where his legs wouldn't obey his mind's commands. Jackie moved again, just a half step toward the drink cooler, his hand reaching out casually, as if to select a beverage that had suddenly appealed to him. The gesture appeared completely natural, the kind of unconscious movement that any customer might make while browsing. But the consequences of that small motion rippled through the store's social geometry like stones thrown into still water. The thief's path to the exit now required him to navigate around someone who seemed completely uninterested in confronting him, yet somehow couldn't be ignored. Jackie had positioned himself not as an obstacle, but as a presence that demanded acknowledgement, a human being whose existence made the thief's intended actions feel suddenly absurd rather than dangerous. The cashier watched this unfold with growing amazement. The stamp pad felt warm under their palm. The receipt roll had gone still. Even the radio seemed to have lowered its volume, as if the entire store was holding its breath. The thief tried to squeeze past Jackie, but the space was tighter than it had appeared. The cash drawer caught the edge of a chip rack, sending packages tumbling. He fumbled to catch them with his free hand, then stopped, realizing how ridiculous he looked. A would-be robber picking up scattered snacks while clutching stolen money. Jackie finally looked directly at him, not with anger or judgment, but with something that might have been understanding. The look didn't say stop or surrender. It simply acknowledged what was happening. A young man making increasingly bad choices in an increasingly impossible situation. The moment stretched. The fluorescent lights continued their buzz. The doorbell had long since stopped swaying. And in that extended pause, something shifted in the thief's expression. The desperate aggression was fading, replaced by a dawning realization that this wasn't going according to any plan he'd imagined. Can control be transmitted through stillness? Can wisdom spread through a room like ripples in still water? Jackie set his milk and crackers on a nearby shelf, the small sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. He didn't reach for the thief, didn't make any threatening moves. Instead, he simply created space. A clear path to the counter where the drawer belonged. An easy way to end this without anyone getting hurt, without anyone losing face. The thief looked at the drawer in his hands. It was heavier now, not just with coins and bills, but with the weight of a mistake that was becoming harder to carry. The metal rails gleamed under the store lights. Receipt paper stuck to his sweaty palms. Around him, a dozen strangers waited with patient attention, not for violence or justice, but for him to choose a better path. What Jackie had done wasn't magic. It wasn't martial arts in any traditional sense. He had simply used the environment, the narrow aisles, the placement of shelves, the natural human tendency to follow visual cues, to create a situation where theft became uncomfortable rather than exhilarating, where speed died in careful obstacles and fear transformed into awkward self-consciousness. The young thief took 3 steps back toward the counter. Each step felt more natural than the last. He set the drawer down carefully, coins settling with a soft metallic whisper. No one applauded. No one said anything at all. The action felt as inevitable as breathing. Jackie nodded slightly, picked up his milk and crackers, and walked to the counter to pay. The cashier's hands were steady as they rang up the small purchase. The stamp pad sat unused. The receipt roll turned smoothly, printing proof of an ordinary transaction on an extraordinary night. The thief walked toward the door, not running now, not fleeing, just leaving. The bell chimed as he pushed it open, the same gentle sound it made for every customer. But this time, it marked the end of something that could have become violence, but had chosen to become lesson instead. As the door closed behind the departing figure, the convenience store's normal sounds returned in layers, like an orchestra tuning up after an extended intermission. The radio's murmur resumed its familiar background role. The fluorescent lights went back to their steady buzz, no longer seeming ominous, but simply functional. A customer cleared their throat and returned to examining product labels. Someone opened a drink cooler, the soft whoosh of cold air providing a counterpoint to the settling atmosphere. The everyday symphony of people going about their business gradually reassembled itself, but now it carried an undercurrent of something new. The shared memory of witnessing control overcome chaos without a single raised voice, without a single aggressive gesture. The cashier touched the receipt roll one more time, fingers tracing the paper's smooth surface as if to confirm that ordinary reality had indeed returned. Then, with movements that felt both familiar and somehow significant, they started counting the money in the returned drawer. Everything was there. Every bill, every coin, even the ones that had scattered across the floor and been carefully retrieved. More than that, something had been added to the night's small collection of moments. Proof that wisdom could work faster than anger, that distance could be more powerful than force, that sometimes the most effective way to stop violence was to refuse to participate in its fundamental logic. Jackie paid for his items with exact change, the transaction proceeding with the mundane efficiency that characterized millions of similar exchanges across the city every night. He thanked the cashier with a polite nod and walked into the Hong Kong night, carrying his small purchases and the quiet satisfaction of a situation that had chosen to go right instead of wrong. Behind him, the convenience store settled back into its familiar rhythm. But the people inside carried with them a question that would linger long after the fluorescent lights were turned off for the night. If 5 seconds of controlled calm could stop a robbery without anyone getting hurt, what other impossible things might become possible when someone chooses wisdom over force? The answer walked out into the humid air, disappearing into the maze of neon-lit streets that never slept. carrying a carton of milk, a package of crackers, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that nobody has to lose.